Here we're picking up with chapter 4.4 called Government Failure and its Attendant Implications. So let's go ahead and dive into it. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to define something called government failure. And the easiest way to define government failure is just simply to compare it back to and contrast it with market failure. Remember, with market failure, something caused the market system of buyers and sellers brought together through property rights has somehow led to a bad outcome. And one of the examples we did was what? Public goods. So lighthouses, for instance. So if private business people built lighthouses and large numbers of sailors and ship owners out there didn't pay because they were hoping to watch the light for free, hoping someone else would pay, we recognize that the total amount of money collected by the lighthouse owners would be so low that we would probably have very few lighthouses and ships would be wrecking all over the place. So we recognize that there's something inherently wrong with a market mechanism when you're dealing with a pure public good. So we recognize the market system would, quote unquote, fail to deliver the right number of lighthouses. Well, let's use the same analogy here now. Government failure means, well, the government might fail to also come up with the right number of things that they're trying to do. So there must be something wrong with the government mechanism. There's something wrong with both market mechanisms, and we identified several things that could cause market mechanisms to go wrong, and the same thing is also true for government. So it turns out that we're now going to do our final definition. Let's look at our second bullet point. Government failure occurs when government intervention fails to improve the economic outcomes and may worsen outcomes. On this slide, we're going to make a picture using the production possibilities frontier to see what a picture of government failure would look like. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at, well, I'm going to put up the bullet points right now. We recognize by definition, we are going to simply assert that point X is the best place to be. It's called the optimal mix that we discussed earlier on when we were discussing market failures. Now, what was point X? Remember, point X is a combination of some degree of healthcare and some amount of all other goods on the two axes, the y-axis and the x-axis. We have specified that the market mix will be more heavily weighted toward all other goods and not enough toward the public good, like healthcare or something like that. So market mechanisms we've already discussed may not reach the optimal mix. But let's take a look at these other mixes, G1, G2, G3, and G4. You notice in every one of those examples, the government got it wrong as well. In G1, the government even did worse than the market system of producing all of the goods and not enough healthcare. In G2, the government overproduced healthcare and didn't produce enough other goods. In G4, they apparently not as badly as the market, but they overproduced all other goods and underproduced healthcare. The point being, in every one of those examples, the government is also making a mistake, just like the market made a mistake. And then we have a final position, G3. G3 is inside the production possibilities frontier, meaning that it's inefficient. So in that example, the government could have produced more of both healthcare and all other goods if they didn't have such a bureaucracy problem and therefore were inefficient. So we recognize that the government can get it wrong due to poor cost-benefit analysis, lots of political interference, and bureaucracy. So all of those reasons could cause the government to also have a failure. Can we trust government to fix things? Let's take a look at the public perception is that government isn't producing as many services as it could with the resources at its disposal. What does that mean? Well, this is just a different way of saying that many people believe that the government right now is producing inside the production possibilities frontier. In other words, it has the resources to produce more of both sets of goods, but for some reason, because of its inefficiency in some way, it's underproducing both goods. So we talked about one of the methods on the previous slide, the problem that we have with bureaucracy. Bureaucracies are terrible at organizing production and getting it done efficiently because there's no profit motive. You can't lose money if you screw up. You get paid whether you make a good decision or a bad decision. Government officials just don't have the incentive structure in order to do good things. And we see that with the public schools not doing as good as they should. All kinds of government activities are not done as well as they could be done. So the related question then is, are we giving up too many private sector goods in order to get those government services? Well, of course, that could be true. It could very well be that the government is producing things so inefficiently and sucking up so many resources that we could have had way more private sector goods. Because remember, every time you pay taxes in order for a government to actually do something, when you pay the taxes, you no longer have resources to do the things in the private sector that you would like to do. So that's a really interesting question. Does government have too high an opportunity cost given how inefficient they often are? Well, let's go on with another slide on the same topic. Can we trust government to fix things? So additional public sector activity is desirable only if the benefits from the activity exceed its opportunity costs. Let me give you an example where I think the answer is clearly yes. We have a smoke detector in the very room I'm talking to you from. I'm assuming you have a smoke detector in your room as well. That's because it's mandated by government. You must have a smoke detector by law in your room, usually in rooms that you sleep in. Bedrooms are required to have them. Now, is that a good thing? Did the government do something for us where the benefits outweigh the cost? Well, what's the cost of putting in a smoke detector? 20 bucks? And what's the benefit? It could save your life. I think that's a pretty good deal, right? I hope you all will agree that this was probably a really, really smart move. The total amount of money invested in smoke detectors is relatively small. The benefit might be hundreds of lives saved. That's clearly a huge benefit. But let me run another example by you. Let's assume that some government official said, wow, look at the good things we did by requiring people have smoke detectors. I got a new idea. I noticed that hotels and apartments and condos all have sprinkler systems in them to prevent fire. Why don't we require sprinkler systems for single-family homes? Well, let's think about the costs and the benefits. First of all, is there a large opportunity cost for putting a sprinkler system in a house? Yes, it'll probably cost close to $10,000 to install a sprinkler system in an individual home. What are the benefits? Well, there are some benefits. Maybe someone sleeping in the middle of the night doesn't hear the fire alarm go off. It's hard to imagine that you could sleep through a fire alarm, but let's assume that you did sleep through it, or that the fire alarm failed and you didn't know there's a fire going on, and so now the sprinkler triggers on, soaks you, and puts the fire out. You're miserable that you got wet, but you realize, oh, it saved my life. So that would be the benefit, right, of having a sprinkler system in your house. What about the costs, though? We've already mentioned maybe it costs $10,000. As compared to the smoke detector example, do you recognize that, boy, this is an expensive way to save only a handful of people? Because the number of people that the smoke detector doesn't save is incredibly small. In single-family homes in the United States, the number of people who die from a fire that they don't know about because of a failed smoke detector is minuscule. But if you multiplied the 100 million houses times $10,000 per house to retrofit a sprinkler system, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. Would, in fact, this new law actually improve the United States, or would it make things worse? In my opinion, it would make things worse, because I don't believe the benefits would be anywhere near large enough to justify the costs. Whereas for an apartment building, it does make sense because a fire in one unit quickly spreads to the other units, and it could burn down multiple people's apartments, not just one person. Whereas a single-family home, a fire gets started, it usually only damages the one house. It doesn't spread to the others because there's space between the houses, so the fire doesn't spread. So for single-family homes, I think it would be a bad idea for the government to mandate sprinklers. For apartments and hotels and condos, it's a good decision. My point is there's no easy one-size-fits-all answer to these questions. You really do have to measure what are the benefits, what are the costs, and then last but not least on this slide, whose value should you use to do this? In other words, how do you value a life? That's a darn hard question to answer, isn't it? So, answering the question now, is the additional public sector activity desirable? Difficult question. In principle, easy. When benefits exceed costs, do it. But knowing when you've done that is relatively difficult. Now, continuing on in slide number 3 on this issue of can we trust government to fix things. The next thing to consider is to do anything through a government, you use a voting mechanism. Market mechanisms use buying and selling. Governments use voting mechanisms, at least in democratic societies, and that's the ones we're going to be looking at. Do voting mechanisms allocate resources to the public sector properly? Well, there's a lot of problems with voting mechanisms. We'll just discuss one, the one we have a bullet statement for. The problem is that voting mechanisms respond to majorities of people. In other words, if 51% of the population wants something and the other 49% of the population doesn't want something, the government will simply force it on to the 49% who don't want it, because once the majority votes on something, it's a done deal. So the problem I want you all to recognize is, unlike a market mechanism, let's use the example of electric cars. Who are the only people that are going to have electric cars? How about people who don't want them? Will they be forced to have one in a market system? Well, of course, the answer is no. You notice with a market system, every single person who gets something, it's something they want. You can't be forced to buy something you don't want. Whereas with voting mechanisms, you can be forced to pay taxes for something that you don't want. So that's one of the major problems with democratic voting systems is, even though we all prefer democracy to, say, a military dictator, the reality is even democracy has certain flaws within it as well, which of course we're calling government failure. Let's look at point 4 now under the rubric of can we trust government to fix things. Now we're talking about something called public choice. Public choice is the name economists have given to the theory of public sector behavior, emphasizing rational self-interest of decision makers and voters. That's just a fancy way of saying that when people go into government, they don't become angels. They are not perfect people. They have their own rational self-interest, just as we described earlier. They want to achieve their goals, and so do voters. So the problem, of course, is that government decision makers are supposed to serve the people, meaning all the people. However, because they have their own interests, they oftentimes set their own agenda. In other words, they pass laws that benefit themselves rather than laws that benefit the entire society. Or they pass laws that benefit a particular subsection of the population that we call special interest groups, and they take care of them rather than doing something that's good for the entire society. And we recognize this all the time. We see it in politics. Politicians are constantly trying to protect some special interest group, whether it's beneficial for the entire welfare of society. And then last but not least on this, bureaucrats are just as selfish or utility maximizing as everyone else. I don't particularly like the word selfish that's in quote marks. I don't believe people are particularly selfish. I think they're self-interested. There's a difference. Selfishness means self-interest taken beyond legitimate goal or legitimate bounds. So selfishness is always wrong in my opinion. But you can be self-interested and be perfectly within normal human interactions. Let me give you a quick example. Let's see, I want to go sailing this weekend, but my yard needs to be mowed, and I don't want to do it because I'd rather be sailing. How about one of you guys agreeing to come over and mow my grass for free? How many of you all will volunteer to do that? I'm not going to give you any special grades, no special consideration, just do it for free. How many people volunteer? Well, very few, right? I'd say none. And of course the reason is you all are self-interested. But so am I, right? I'm not claiming that I'm somehow noble and you're being self-interested. My point is that economists believe all human beings are self-interested. But that also means government leaders are self-interested. When they get elected, they're also trying to serve their own interests. And sometimes those interests, the interests of the bureaucracy that runs the government, the self-interest of the elected officials, tends to come into conflict with what's good for society as a whole. So let's take a look at public choice's theory about benefit cost analysis. So let's compare two different sectors, the private sector and the government sector, and just see how cost benefit analysis works. So first of all, let's look at the far left side, the private sector. Benefits and costs accrue to the same person, which is a fancy way of saying when you go to buy something, let's buy a car. Let's buy a nice Mercedes, a nice $100,000 Mercedes. When you're thinking about signing on that dotted line, you are comparing costs and benefits, aren't you? You're thinking about how much pleasure will I get from having this Mercedes? And then also, how many things do I have to give up? $100,000 worth of other things you could have bought now have to be given up. But you notice, in a market system, the decision of who gets the benefits and who gets the costs are in the same person. So that person can make an easy comparison. Every one of us can come to a decision relatively easily about, will I get enough benefit from a $100,000 Mercedes to justify spending that kind of money? The answer for me personally is no. It turns out when I had that choice to make, I ended up choosing instead a Hyundai Santa Fe, so I would have enough money left over to buy the boat I also want. So instead of buying a Mercedes and having no boat, I chose a different combination. I chose a much lower quality car, a Hyundai, and a boat as a combination, which to me is superior to a Mercedes. Now, of course, you may have come to a different decision, and you bought the Mercedes, I bought the Santa Fe and the boat. The point I want you all to recognize here is in the private sector, cost-benefit analysis is easy to do because each person makes the decision separately, and they compare their own benefit and their own cost, which is something they actually know something about, and they usually get the right decision. Now let's go to make the same decision in a government. The government's going to have to make a decision. Do we allocate Mercedes to people, or do we allocate Hyundais and boats to people? Now, it turns out that, oh, and by the way, we're going to tax some people and give it to others. So the benefits and costs are now going to accrue to different groups. In other words, I'm going to get the boat, but you have to pay the taxes. Now, what do you think decision I will come to on the kind of boat I want if I get the boat, but you get stuck with the taxes? Oh, I think you all realize very quickly I'd want a pretty fancy boat, wouldn't I? That's the problem. Unlike the previous example where I had to make a decision, do I want the super fancy car or will I accept a less fancy car so that I can do something else? Once we go to government and we shift the cost not to ourselves but to others through the tax system, people start demanding things that they themselves would not want if they had to pay for it themselves. So right off the bat, we see government has a very serious problem knowing what the truth is about how valuable something is to people. Next issue, it makes it very difficult for the decision maker, in this case, the government official. The government official really doesn't know whether they should be producing a Mercedes quality whatever or a Hyundai quality whatever in order to make people truly better off. And then, of course, politics enters into the decision. A lot of times the decision is made based on satisfying very, very vocal special interest groups. Whether the issue is the abortion issue, whether the interest issue is public schools, there's all kinds of things the government gets involved in. Oftentimes we get a decision not based on what would make everybody happy. We usually are stuck in a situation where we are trying to satisfy super vocal minorities because the minority of people who are super interested in that particular issue will vote on that specific issue, whereas most of us, we're not really motivated enough to fight the issue. So oftentimes politics leads us in the wrong direction. And then last but not least, the decision maker may have no stake in the outcome. For instance, someone my age, I can't, and I'm also a man, so I can't have a child that I'm stuck with that I don't want. If I'm the one making the decision on abortion, I don't have as much stake in the game as a woman does, right? So does everyone recognize the decision could be very different? If only women could vote, Not that it wouldn't be a contentious issue. Many women are opposed to abortion as well. I'm just trying to search for an example where you can see that decision makers who have no personal stake in the outcome might make potentially bad decisions. Whereas the example I gave earlier of the Mercedes purchase versus the Santa Fe purchase, clearly you have a very big stake in the outcome. If you get it wrong, if you buy the Mercedes when you'd really rather have a Santa Fe and a sailboat, you're going to have to give up the boat, and that's going to hurt. And you will know that you made the wrong decision. Whereas for government officials, oftentimes they don't even know they're making the wrong decision because they don't really have any skin in the game, so to speak. Last slide on this particular set of concepts. So, what is the role of government? Can either the market-based or the state-run system, or a combination of the two, which is what we really have in our country, produce the mix of output desired by society in general? Well, we already know a pure market system will not produce adequate quantities of some goods. They will fall down on the job on pure public goods. They will overproduce polluting goods or negative externality goods. They will underproduce positive externality goods. They may have an issue of equity where a certain level of fairness is not taking place because we don't want some people, just because they can't work, to have literally no food. I mean, so we recognize that certain kinds of interventions in the market system may be absolutely necessary. But we also know from history, because we've seen pure government systems like the Soviet Union, Communist China back when under Mao Zedong, we've seen Vietnam, we've seen Cuba. Pure government systems oftentimes have very bad screw-ups of not determining the mix of output desired by buyers and sellers. Because the government officials don't have the information, they don't have any skin in the game, they're bureaucrats, so they have power plays of their own that they're trying to pull against other government officials, and so oftentimes pure government systems really mess things up. The Soviet Union was an economic basket case, and it turned out they didn't get more fairness for people. In fact, they produced so far inside the production possibilities frontier that most people gave up most good things. Really tragic situation. But our last bullet point is, by trial and error, can a combination of the two systems arrive at an optimal mix of goods produced? Well, hopefully. I'm not as hopeful as your author, who seems to believe, oh yes, by trial and error we will accomplish this. I think having a mixed system is the best we can hope for, but of course it's going to also lead to a lot of inefficiencies as well. So given that, let's go ahead and call it quits on Chapter 4.